Scandinavian countries keep topping the happiness charts, and I figured out the secret. It's the Scandinavian Defense. It's just so good. In my opinion, it's probably the most underrated chess opening, because most people assume it's lame simply because you gotta bring your queen out and then your shameless opponent is gonna attack it and make it dance. But here's a really simple trick. You just don't capture the pawn right away. Instead, you develop your knight and then capture it with a knight. With that, you're gaining a nice attacking position. Plus, you get your opponent out of his opening prep right away, right on the very first move, basically, of the game. No gambits anymore, no Vienna gambit, no nothing. It's your opening that you know. Well, maybe you don't know it yet, but you will after this video, because you will learn literally everything that you need to know. Now, in this position, your opponents mostly will play knight to c3. Some of them, those who are more greedy, will play c4, trying to hold on to their extra pawn. And the move that is considered the strongest, that computer recommends, and intermediate to advanced players choose to place the move pawn to d4. We'll actually talk about all the alternatives so that you are fully ready. But let's start from this move, which is considered the most challenging for black potentially. What you can do here is, of course, you can just stick to the plan and simply get back your pawn, and that is totally fine. We'll talk about that. But what I love doing here is this move bishop g4, which totally pushes your opponent off the edge, because now he's totally confused. He doesn't even know what to do. Of course, white doesn't have to lose the queen. White can protect it one way or the other, but if white sticks to a passive defense, that's just not a problem. Let's say white simply tries to hold on to his position. Now you can even capture with a queen, because now you also add one more attack to this pinned knight, and then potentially you can bring the knight out, also putting some pressure down here, and let's say you cancel queenside, adding even more pressure to the central pawn. Like your bishop is putting pressure, maybe even e5 break is coming at some point. Therefore, like, that is clearly not dangerous for you if your opponent just tries to be defensive. A more aggressive attempt by your opponent would be to push the pawn forward, hitting your bishop, and once the bishop moves, now they can actually hold on to this extra pawn. And they really should, because if not, you're going to simply take it back, and their position is kind of ruined already. The king is somewhat exposed by this f-pawn move, the knight cannot be developed normally. That's really not good for white. However, after c4, it actually looks pretty bright for your opponent, because now not only white is up a pawn, they've got really this chunk of pawns in the middle of the board. However, we've got something prepared. First off, you play pawn e6, undermining this pawn center, and once he captures, you keep playing reckless chess, knight to c6, attacking this pawn on d4. From your opponent's perspective, you are totally nuts, because now not only you keep giving up more material, now you also let him expose your king entirely. However, the reality is exactly the opposite. If you look at what your opponent have done so far, that is nothing, really. All the places are still standing on their starting squares, while you are already really ready for a big attack, something like bishop b4, rook e8 check, the knight is hitting this pawn, you're developing this massive attack while your opponent is still trying to wake up. At the moment, he needs to do something about that pawn. And if he pushes it forward, which is their usual move, that is yet another mistake. Your knight jumps forward, threatening to come forward with a fork. Now, knight to c2 is coming, therefore they go knight a3 to cover the square, but now you've got this excellent square for your bishop. Not only you develop it, but also you permanently prevent him from castling, because you control this whole diagonal, therefore his king cannot go there. Plus, you also prepare your rook to come into play through this file with a massive attack, and your opponent is already done. Notice that your opponent seemingly played all correct moves. He tried to punish you for your reckless opening choice, but the situation was turned around by you pretty quickly. Now here, the most played move by white is bishop d2, but they can do whatever else. Anyways, rook e8 typically just wins the game here for white, and rook e8 is very good. It wins the game. Even stronger at this point is to sacrifice the knight to open a diagonal for your queen, and that's a lot of fun, actually. So he takes the knight, because why not? Then rook e8 comes with a check. He's got to cover with the bishop. By the way, knight covering leads to this nice smothered checkmate. Pretty cool. If not, of course, bishop e2 is a better choice to block this check. And now we'll see why you sacrificed your knight from here. Actually, you didn't even want that pawn in the middle of the board. You just wanted to free this diagonal for your queen, because now the queen comes out with a check. And if the king moves, that is actually scholar's checkmate. Congratulations. Which can work even against experienced opponent. Now, what if your opponent instead blocks with this pawn? That doesn't really help, because you deliver this knight check, and once the king moves, you then play a brilliant move, queen takes h3. And your chess coach is happy, he's applauding you for finding a brilliant move, but then your opponent captures the queen, and you're like, oops, I didn't notice there's a knight there. But then you find out that after bishop recaptures, that is actually still a brilliant checkmate. Bringing the bishop out here is really cool, but besides that, there is another line which is even trickier for your opponents to handle. It is actually sticking to your original plan and just recapturing this pawn with a knight. Now, your opponent will probably wish to attack it, and then you can go knight to b4, which is a very provocative move. It's typical Igor Nation stuff. Good things come to those who bait. And by the way, if Stockfish is disgusted by the move, don't trust him. You know, I played the Scandinavian Defense in real-life tournaments against grandmasters. For humans, it's not easy to handle, and for Blitz, it's just killing it. Alright, now they will probably attack this knight either with a pawn or with a queen, and I'll show you what to do in both cases. If they try to be the most aggressive and play queen a4 with this double attack, looks like you messed up, like you're about to just lose this knight, because white is also checking your king. You cover with a knight, and now they realize that, wait a second, d5 just wins the knight. It can't move because it's pinned. That's what your opponent is hoping for, but you break the plan with this sudden counter-strike pawn b5. You want to break the pin on this knight so that it's free to go. But your opponent is persistent, he captures with a queen and insists on the pin. But what he overlooked is that now the queen no longer controls that square, and therefore your knight can jump there with a fork. The king goes somewhere, and that leads to one of the most satisfying opening variations I've ever seen. So in this case, the position still looks very complicated. And this move bishop d7 is really elegant. Now what can he do? Notice that the rook is still hanging, the king is still awkward, and therefore of course white will probably wish to capture one of your knights, right? Either that one or this one. If the king captures on c2, then after knight to d4 that counts with a fork, and now the king is still exposed and they're also losing the queen. That's clearly bad for them. If instead they capture this knight over here, then you come up with a very interesting response. It's a bishop g4 with a sudden double check. This forces the white king to move and capture the knight, and now since the white queen went out on vacation, the black queen can take its place. Now queen d1 is a check, forcing the king to move. Now you grab the bishop with yet another check. The king has to go again. It probably does not want to go somewhere here because that would allow you to also attack across the d file. If it tries to hide on the king side, which seems like a safer option, you've got another interesting way of attacking from behind with the bishop check. Now that forces the king to go here, and now that's one of the most satisfying positions, really. You know, there was that famous Fischer quote who said that e4, the first move, is best by test. He'd probably agree that in this case pawn e5 is even better, because e5 is something that ordinary players play on move 1 to start their game, and you play it here to end the game. It's almost a checkmate because it opens up this bishop check. And together with the second bishop, that actually forms this checkmating pattern. The other cool thing is that white cannot even block with this pawn because that pawn is pinned by the queen, therefore that's not an option. Which means that white can just give up some material, but that is essentially a checkmate. Now let's talk about the supposed refutation. It seems easy for white to simply kick the knight out by playing pawn to a3. How about that? Does that refute the whole thing? Not really. Let me show you most played moves by white after that. The knight retreats back, and now you still hit the central pawn on d4. The pawn comes forward, attacking your knight, the knight runs away. Now bishop f4 is very tempting, trying to gain a tempo, hitting the knight, but you do the same, you retreat with a counter strike, forcing the bishop to move. And as the bishop moves, you play e5 just to occupy some space in the center and to open up your bishop. Now the position is balanced, more or less fine, but let's see what happens usually after that and how can you develop your attack. Let's say your opponent develops, you go pawn f5, and that already comes with a threat of pawn coming forward and capturing the bishop. Your opponent tries to provide an escape square, but you say, I'm taking that diagonal myself. That's a really great diagonal for the bishop again. Your opponent will never be able to castle. That's really cool. Potentially the bishop can come forward if necessary, but for now, both sides will probably just develop. And now that's a really interesting position. Like, how would you attack here if you were black? Like, there is one nice thing that we've got here. His king is centralized. It can't easily castle anytime soon. But of course he'll try to. Therefore, how would you attack? Now, in order to find attacking moves, you gotta come forward to his side of the board and create threats. The move something like f4 comes to mind, and it's not a bad idea, but there is an obvious downside. He'll move the bishop away, but later he'll have this great square for his knight, and from there the knight will really control everything on the board. So how do you push the pawn forward without giving up this square? You do that by pushing this pawn forward first and sacrificing it, just to lock the position for his pieces, and now you push the other pawn forward, which is your original intent. And the trick is here, now this knight can come here, the bishop is totally stuck, surrounded by his own pawns, and therefore white's got no bright future, But now you simply keep attacking. You attack the bishop. It has to come back. Now forces the king to move. How do you attack here? Still the same pattern. Look at your opponent's side of the board. Ask yourself, how can I go forward? Create threats, force some moves. Queen h4, checking the king. Your rook is also right here. Therefore, something like this is not going to work, or it's going to work really terribly for his opponent, right? Therefore, the king will have to get out of the check. Let's say come in here or here. In both cases, you still pursue the same thinking pattern. Come forward, create threats on his side of the board. Pawn to f3, activates your rook and exposes the king entirely. Now if he captures, no problem, your rook comes into play with the checkmate and threats. If he does whatever else, no problem, you just keep attacking, keep asking yourself, how do I come forward, playing forcing moves. And of course your opponent could play something else, but overall that's the idea, that's how you develop an attack here. And once the king comes back, there is also a very interesting position here. You've got him with queen f6, and I think it's quite a unique idea, or at least I cannot easily recall anything else, because it's a triple checkmating threat. So from here, the queen threatens to play either to f2 with checkmating 1, or queen to d4, same checkmating 1, or queen to b6, still attacking along this diagonal. And the interesting thing is, white can easily cover any one of those squares, but not three at once, which makes it defenseless for white, and you win the game on the next move. And by the way, if you want to learn how to find such attacking moves on your own without relying on memorizing all these opening lines, I've got a free masterclass about that. I'll drop a link down below. You can check it out later if you will. You may be thinking, Igor, it's so nice, but my opponents don't play d4, and you're probably right, because d4 is played by intermediate to advanced level players, and beginners typically play knight to c3 here, just developing a knight, which is harmless, because it does not even defend the pawn. You can capture it, you've got this queen supporting the knight. In this case, they typically continue with trading off, and now you can see that the white knight was just horsed around, wasted his youth for no good reason. You simply recapture, and white achieved remarkably nothing within those first moves. Moreover, right now they don't even have that knight to come forward and possibly hit your queen, which is considered the main drawback of the Scandinavian defense, but not anymore. And now after white will play whatever moves, you're going to develop, and in this case, since you already developed your queen, it's quite nice that you can quickly castle queenside, also adding your rook into play. For instance, at some point they'll probably move the d pawn forward because they need to also open up this bishop. And then you go bishop g4, doubling down on this knight on f3, right? If white wants to avoid doubling pawns, plays bishop e2, now you castle queenside, not only casting your king, but also adding up more firepower against this central pawn on d4. And as white develops it, defends it, I should say, then e5 breaks the center and very often just wins the game, because it attacks the pawn, threatens to come forward, and if the pawn is captured, that is actually a decisive error, but it's a very tricky one, because you don't take here, you don't take here, instead you play queen to e4, and that is a very interesting idea. That is a discovered attack of the queen, and also it puts your queen against the king. And those two ideas combined make it such that also there's this bishop threat right here, and you just overpower your opponent with all these threats. For example, right now white needs to do something against this direct threat to the queen. If the queen moves, you capture this pawn on e5. This time, this knight on f3 is in danger. You're attacking it 3 times with your queen, knight, and bishop, and all of them want to grab the knight. The king is still centralized. It also can't castle away easily because that would drop the bishop. You can simply go ahead and capture it. Therefore, that's not a solution. And if instead white tries to simply trade knights right here, you don't recapture the knight, you recapture the bishop, and it's a checkmate. Another move that you'll definitely face at times is c4, simply defending this extra pawn on d5, and now you undermine it, and we end up with a classical gambit situation where you gambited a pawn for quick development and chances for attack. Now your opponent will probably push this pawn forward because otherwise it will be a backward pawn, weakness, and white can't develop his bishop otherwise, therefore d4 will probably be played, and then you go bishop b4, checking the king. Since you're down a pawn but ahead in development, you want to go forward, quickly create threats. Now knight c3 is the most natural move to play, and then knight to e4, you start capitalizing on your development advantage right away, this time threatening knight twice. The knight is pinned down to the king, therefore it can't move, and at first it may seem like, what's such a big deal about that? White can simply defend this knight somehow. Okay, but how exactly? If white comes, let's say, knight to e2, supporting the knight that way, then it actually drops this pawn on c4, which was no longer defended by the light square bishop. Moreover, now we have a pretty solid pressure all around. That certainly does not feel nice for white. What else can white play to defend this knight, which is attacked twice and pinned? How about queen to c2? Now this one's simply going to be captured, queen to c2. Also, looks pretty logical. Defends the knight and attacks yours. There's a really sadistic variation right here. After an exchange of knights, your opponent expects this bishop to move, but instead, you play queen takes d4. A really cool crisscross tactic. Here, like, the pawn cannot capture the queen because it's pinned that way. And if the pawn captures the bishop, then it drops the rook that way. So it's really remarkable position where, of course, white can just play something dull and defend the pawn, but then they're at a positional disadvantage, and you've got a great position. Probably the most natural attempt to neutralize the pin would be to play bishop to d2. But that is also a blunder. In this case, this central pawn on d4, which is no longer guarded by the white queen because of that bishop that stands in the way. And now you already took over, you're having a massive attack all around, you're probably already having a winning position. And an attempt to fight back only makes it worse because it blunders mate in 1. There's also another little but very useful thing to know here. In case white covers with the bishop, do not take it. To take is a mistake, one of the classical rules of the Igor nation, right? Do not help your opponent develop. Instead, play queen e7, which combines your development and defense of the bishop. After that, you're probably going to be playing something like knight c6 and castle queenside to bring all your pieces into the attack very quickly. And if white tries to play something like queen to a4, hoping to grab your bishop on the next move, then you ain't going to simply cover or defend. You're going to play bishop d7, which comes as a very unexpected surprise for your opponent, because your opponent will try to capture this bishop, but will notice that something is not right, and then will realize that his own king is in check. Therefore, bishop d7 was actually a pretty fancy counter check. He played queen a4, checking your king, but you covered with a counter check. And since his king now needs to do something about that check, that will drop the queen on a4. What if your opponent does not even take that pawn on d5? Well, what else can he do? Just defending it is no good for white, because after an exchange, you can take this queen on d1, force the white king to move, and now white will be a defender, and white does not achieve anything right here. Therefore, that's not an option. But knight to f3 is a lot more dangerous try, because if you're unfamiliar with the gambit, you'll probably lose the game quickly. Here, white is hoping for this so-called Tennison Gambit, attacking the pawn. Once you defend it, they go on pawn to d3, attacking this pawn for the second time. And let me first show you the trap so that you're aware of what your opponent is hoping for. After a trade, this knight on g5 seems intimidating, and if you play pawn to h6, your opponent will sack the knight right here, continue with this discovered attack, and because your king is in check, you're about to lose the queen, and your king is exposed, and white wins the game. That is what your opponent is hoping for. Now, how do you counteract? Actually pretty simple. To take is a mistake, and it applies to this position just as well. We do not want to take and help your opponent to develop his bishop. Instead, you want to attack yourself. Play bishop g4, and that messes up his plans right away. The bishop is supported by the knight, therefore he cannot capture it. He's got to do something against this threat. And what can he do? If he goes with the bishop, you can take it, then you can take right here. You also have the queen right here, and again, he'll probably end up with some weak pawns and no attack. He just ruined his position. If instead white plays f3, which is the most played move by white right here, you simply take that pawn, and now either the knight has to come back, achieving nothing, or the pawn will take, and once the bishop moves back right here to h5, white actually did everything he could to ruin his position. White is down a pawn, the king is totally exposed, all these weaknesses all around, and of course no attack for white, you're going to be the one attacking. And another move that you guys have asked me about a lot is, what if white, instead of countering the pawn, simply pushes it forward? What do you do here? Well, it's actually relatively simple, because what you end up getting here is an improved version of the French defense, or an advanced version of the Caracan defense. You go c5, and since this pawn is on your side of the board, far away from the rest of his army, it's very easy for this pawn to get lost. For example, let's say he develops, you do the same thing, and white can do whatever, knight c3, bishop e2, whatever. Then after bishop going to g4, if white is careless, you're going to end up capturing this pawn. At this position, I'm not even sure if there's any way for white to save it. I don't think so, because after whatever white does here, you can trade off the knight, who is the only defender of this pawn, and then you simply grab it. White just lost that advanced pawn on e5 for no reason. Also, what if you cannot win this pawn? Let's say white already has this central pawn chain with c3 and d4. I'll show you just an example plan. It's not the exact variation, because right here you can simply take the knight and take the pawn, and that's what you should do. But let's say somewhere earlier, white already has played c3 and then pawn to d4, so now there's no easy way for you to take that pawn. Let's say we have a position like that. What are you going to do here? Well, still, it reminds you very closely the French defense, with one major difference right here, that this bishop, instead of being dull on c8, what we usually have in the French defense. Here it's on g4 in a very active position, helping your attack. And now you can just shift your attack to this pawn. Since the pawn on e5 is very well defended, you attack the base of the pawn chain, the pawn which has no support from other pawns. And now with the knight coming to f5, you have these two knights attacking this pawn. Your bishop is ready to capture on f3 anytime you need to eliminate the defender. Your queen can come there to b6 to add even more pressure. You've got the c-file for your rook, and at some point you're simply going to play bishop e7 and castle kingside. So that is your plan. You've got a lot of great things to do, and you're going to put pressure to the central pawn on d4. By the way, if you want to know a simple, clear attack and plan in the Italian game for white, this video is going to help. And if you want your opponent to question their life choices overall, head to this free masterclass up there.